China. The country that everyone's talking about, whether it's in the context of economic growth, military power, or geopolitical dominance. For decades, the world seemed convinced that China's rise was either inevitable or doomed to fail. We've heard it all. The Chinese economy was a ticking time bomb, its political system too rigid to sustain growth, or that its rise was just another flash in the pan. Western pundits love to debate whether China could really keep up its economic miracle, or if it would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Some said it was just too big to fail. Yet, here we are in 2025, and China is not only still standing, but it's thriving like never before. The nation that once languished in the depths of poverty, crippled by political turmoil and economic isolation, has somehow transformed itself into a global superpower. And believe it or not, it didn't take magic. China's rise wasn't about luck or sheer force. It was about planning, patience, and a willingness to think long-term in ways the rest of the world failed to do. So how did China pull off this astonishing transformation? Let's break it down and see how the Middle Kingdom became the world's heavyweight. Economic reforms and opening up. Let's dive into the foundation of China's rise, economic reform. Back in 1978, China wasn't the powerhouse it is today. In fact, it was struggling, recovering from the damage of the Cultural Revolution with an economy that was barely moving. People were still living in poverty, and the country's industries were outdated. But then Deng Xiaoping stepped in with a vision that would change everything. He didn't just want to tweak things, he wanted a complete overhaul. He shifted China from a closed, centrally planned economy to something a lot more market-friendly. Deng introduced his reform and opening up policy, and suddenly China went from being isolated to saying, "Hey world, we're open for business." Foreign companies were invited in, private businesses were allowed to grow, and China's economy slowly started to open up to the global market. But here's where it gets really interesting. Deng didn't just throw everything wide open at once. He was strategic. Instead of rushing into full-on market capitalism, he started by setting up special economic zones, SEZs, like Shenzhen. Back in the 1980s, Shenzhen was just a small fishing village, barely on the map. Today, it's a global tech hub, home to giant companies like Huawei and Tencent, and it produces more smartphones than any other city on Earth. In fact, Shenzhen alone is responsible for around 10% of China's GDP. That's not just progress, that's a revolution. And the world noticed. These SEZs offered cheap labor, business-friendly regulations, and access to the massive Chinese market, making them a magnet for foreign investment. In just a few decades, China turned from a country of poverty to one of the world's top economies. Between 1980 and 2000, China's economy grew by an average of 10% every year. To put that into perspective, the US was growing at about 3% a year, and many other countries weren't growing much at all. While the rest of the world was stuck in traffic, China was zooming ahead on the fast lane. So, if you think China's rise was some kind of miracle, take a moment and consider the numbers. Over a 20-year period, China's economy quadrupled in size, all while the global economy was growing at a much slower pace. And this growth didn't happen by accident. It was the result of decades of careful planning, bold decisions, and a willingness to experiment. China wasn't just playing catch-up, it was playing the long game, setting itself up for a future where it would dominate the global stage. How China become the world's factory. By the early 2000s, China wasn't just open to the world, it was dominating it. You see, China became the world's factory, and the world had to adjust to this new reality. Everything, from your smartphone to your socks, was now made in China. And no, that doesn't mean China was making subpar products. Quite the opposite. Over time, it honed its manufacturing to such a degree that it became virtually impossible to compete with Chinese manufacturing. Now, some people might say, oh, but China's just a cheap labor market. Well, in the early days, sure. But by the time China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, its factories were producing quality goods at an industrial scale. For those of us who remember the early days of Chinese exports, it's hard to ignore the dramatic shift. China started out making cheap plastic toys, and by the mid-2000s was producing high-tech products, from electronics to cars. And it wasn't just about products, it was about the entire supply chain. You know all those little parts that make up a laptop? Yeah, China probably made most of them. By 2010, China was not only producing goods for the world, but it had become the world's central supply chain hub. It had mastered the art of mass production, but with a dash of quality and precision that no one had seen coming. So let's break it down. In 1990, China accounted for 1% of global manufacturing. By 2018, that number was closer to 28%. That's not a small change. That's a whole new world order. While Western countries were debating whether they could still compete in manufacturing, China was out there creating a global empire of factories and technology.
China's global influence through trade and investment. We've all heard of China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, but let's pause and really think about it for a second. China wasn't content with just becoming the world's factory, it had bigger plans. The BRI isn't just about building roads and railways, it's about creating a new global order. Through strategic investments in infrastructure, China is connecting itself to Asia, Africa, and even Europe, while spreading its influence beyond its borders. Take a moment to think about the Chinese infrastructure projects you've heard about in places like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, or Kenya. It's not just about building roads, it's about creating economic highways. These projects are designed to boost growth, trade, and opportunity in countries that have long been neglected by the West. And here's the catch: China doesn't wait for permission from anyone. While Western nations debate over whether to invest in the future, China just goes ahead and builds it. By 2023, China had become the largest global investor in infrastructure, something that would have seemed impossible just 40 years ago. It's a quiet but powerful form of domination. While the U.S. has spent decades meddling in the affairs of other countries like Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, trying to impose its will through regime changes and coups, China has been quietly building bridges across the world. China's investments aren't about interfering, they're about offering partnerships and creating long-term economic ties that benefit everyone. And it's not just physical infrastructure, China is also shaping the future through technology. While the West was stuck debating privacy issues and data concerns, China has been rolling out the next generation of 5G technology at breakneck speed. By 2023, Chinese companies like Huawei were leading the charge, making China the undisputed leader in the digital race. While the U.S. was still struggling with its own tech giants, China was already creating the future.
China's stability advantage. All right, we've covered the economy, manufacturing, and tech, but none of this could have happened without one thing: China's political stability. You've got to admit, there's something refreshing about a government that has a clear vision and the power to implement it. Unlike many democracies, where change comes with every election cycle and long-term planning feels like a pipe dream, China's Communist Party has been able to stick to its long-term goals. Since the reforms of the late 70s, China has been on a trajectory that the West can't seem to match. No, it's not perfect, and it never claimed to be, but it has been remarkably consistent in its economic and political objectives. The current leadership under Xi Jinping is arguably the most assertive China has ever been on the world stage. While Western countries are busy debating their own internal conflicts, China is laser-focused on the Chinese dream, its vision of becoming a global leader and restoring its historical position in the world. People might criticize China for its authoritarian politics, but the reality is that this political stability has played a huge role in maintaining the country's rapid growth. China's ability to execute long-term plans without interruption is exactly what has made it a global powerhouse.
China's strategy for global influence. While the world often focuses on China's economic growth and military might, its influence on the global stage extends far beyond that. It's not just about being a dominant economic player. It's about strategically positioning itself as a global leader in diplomacy and international relations. From hosting the Olympics in 2008 to leading key international institutions like the United Nations, China has skillfully elevated its presence in global affairs. When China took the helm of the UN Security Council in 2019, it was clear that Beijing wasn't just participating in global governance, it was shaping it. China's growing influence in organizations like the World Trade Organization, WTO, and its participation in the G20 show that it's not just watching the global game, it's playing it. But China's strategy isn't just about diplomatic rhetoric, it's about economic diplomacy. Across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, China's approach is all about making friends and building lasting relationships through investment. While the US and Europe have traditionally focused on aid and charity, China has been building infrastructure, roads, ports, and railways in exchange for long-term economic partnerships. Take Africa, for example. China is Africa's largest trading partner, investing billions into key infrastructure projects like railways in Ethiopia and the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway in Kenya. In 2020, China's trade with Africa hit over $200 billion, far outpacing the US and European Union. China's strategy is clear. By helping these nations grow economically, China is cementing itself as their most important partner. China's influence extends beyond just trade and investments. It's about reshaping the geopolitical landscape. Where the U.S. has used military interventions and soft power like aid to influence countries, China is relying on what we might call a subtle takeover. No tanks, no missiles, just pure economic power and strategic partnerships. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, is perhaps the most ambitious example of this strategy. Through the BRI, China has promised over $4 trillion in investments to countries around the world, positioning itself as the leader in global infrastructure development. From Sri Lanka's Hambantota port to the China-Pakistan economic corridor, these projects not only boost China's trade and influence, they also lock in long-term partnerships with key countries. As these countries grow more dependent on Chinese investment and infrastructure, they're aligning themselves more with China's global vision. It's a new kind of power, built on partnerships, trade, and influence, not military dominance. China didn't just happen to become a global superpower. Its rise was the result of meticulous planning, careful calculation, and unwavering execution. From the landmark economic reforms of the late 1970s under Deng Xiaoping to today's powerhouse status in technology, trade, and diplomacy, China's transformation is nothing short of extraordinary. Over the past 4 decades, China has strategically positioned itself as a leader in every key sector, defying predictions that its rise would be temporary or unsustainable. And as much as the West may want to deny it, the reality is clear. China is here to stay. Whether through economic dominance, technological innovation, or diplomatic influence, China is reshaping the global order. So, the next time you hear someone say, China's rise is just a blip, you can smile knowingly and tell them, you're about 40 years too late.